Welcome, viewers, to the Climate Trends podcast. Today, we are going to talk about waste and waste management in India and how technology is playing a role in tackling the issue. The topic is rather important, we feel, because in 2021, it was estimated that India generated 62 million tons of municipal solid waste. This included 5.6 million tons of plastic waste, 7.9 million tons of hazardous waste, and 1.5 million tons of e-waste. Also, India's cumulative waste generation is estimated to rise to 165 million tons by 2030, and therefore it must be managed scientifically if we are to avoid ever-growing landfills and build a circular economy. To talk about this, we are joined today by Siddharth Hande, who is the founder and current CEO of Kabadiwala Connect, an award-winning social enterprise in the field of waste management. Siddharth is a GIS expert with a background in urban governance and sustainability. And at Kabadiwala Connect, he and his team are working to develop scalable and inclusive solutions to the collection, aggregation, and processing of post-consumer waste in India and other countries. Siddharth, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Anil. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you here. Siddharth, could you tell us a little bit about Kabadiwala Connect and what you are aiming to achieve with this venture?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like you said in the preface that waste collection is a critical issue for India, especially actually not just India but also in the global south. And you have this situation right now where everything that gets collected in municipal waste pretty much goes to landfills. And in this gap you have this informal supply chain that's come in to really pick up a lot of recyclable waste. So Kabadiwala connects on a mission to integrate this informal reverse logistics supply chain inclusively into the formal waste management system for better waste collection outcomes.
I see. Okay, that's really interesting. Since you talked about informal waste collection, Siddharth, I'm sure that the informal waste collection sector in India plays an enormous role and it must be critical to the machinery. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You can say that while the formal sector still to this day focuses mainly on landfilling and the costs associated with collection to go to the landfill, it's the informal sector that's really coming in to create these stable material pipelines of post-consumer secondary raw materials. So when you look at the amounts of paper being collected, the amounts of glass, the amounts of PET, water bottles, all of this collection is really attributed to the informal sector at the moment.
I see. Let's briefly talk about the men and women in this informal waste collection sector. I imagine that they must be exposed to all sorts of hazardous material and they must even have to go looking for products to sell. India's hot and humid conditions certainly don't make their job easy. Are there any other challenges that they face?
Yeah, health and safety is the biggest issue. The fact that they're exposed to a lot of hazards in their work. I think especially waste pickers scavenge for materials. So even though, there are these narratives where you can say, oh, look at the amount of PET, it's almost at 90% the amount of PET generated versus collected through the informal sector. We have to remember that it's being collected in a very unsafe and hazardous way. So on a day-to-day basis, they face a lot of health and safety issues. And that is one massive topic that needs to be reconciled with. So, we have to have a situation where we kind of like leverage their system, their supply chain. They've kind of done some really interesting things that allow them to collect waste quite efficiently. But then we need to tackle some core issues like site compliance, labor compliance, like, scavenging. And these are some critical issues that need to be resolved if we are to think of the informal sector as a real kind of like, compliant and legitimate way of the city to work in a more meaningful way. But I think the starting point is very clear that they are really active and efficient in collection. I think there was a statistic which said that for every ton the informal sector collects, the municipality saves 25,000 rupees because it's being handled by that system. So,
Wow.
You're in the situation where waste collection, the costs of waste collection are a massive issue for the municipality. And again, the informal sector is really coming in and doing some of the heavy lifting on recycling.
That's really interesting. 25,000 rupees per ton saved by the municipalities. Okay. Um, Now, let me come to another question. The Indian sector, the Indian cities, rather, they struggle with waste collection itself, let alone segregation and things like extended producer responsibility. Um, so, could you tell us a little bit about how the municipal waste collection machinery even works in India? Is there enough
Sure.
coverage? And what are the opportunities that lie within this sector?
Yeah. Typically, how it works is, of course, it's a public. So waste collection is a public service at the
Mhm.
end of the day. It's the mandate of the municipality. Very specifically, the health commissioner has a very big mandate for it. It comes under the hygiene portfolio of the health commissioner.
Mhm.
And how it's typically organized, it's organized at the ward level, where different cities have done over time different interventions at the ward level to try to create the right level of coverage for the amount of waste that they have to collect. And so you see the municipality directly investing in waste collection infrastructure, um, or giving it to a third party private contract. Now, the issue with the way it's set up is it's a very old school system. It's like pre-circular economy, even though, like there are no real KPIs for segregation of different types of waste, of making sure it ends up in the right places, the right recyclers. So the municipality doesn't do any direct agreements with recyclers. They are really focused on collection, taking that to the transfer station,
Mhm.
and then from the transfer station going to the landfill. And even that system, they really struggle to make the payments, and they say it's quite expensive. There's a World Bank study which says that for municipalities in the global south to implement effective waste collection, it can at this moment cost between 20 to 50% of their available budget. So it just shows the way the municipality is thinking of waste collection, the centralized old school model, probably based on the experiences of, like cities in the global north as they were.
Mhm.
Financed through these traditional development sector kind of things don't really work. They're very centralized in their in the way they do things. And so the cost of collection is just this massive issue over there. And you have this kind of traditional type of infrastructure. That's not the case everywhere. There has been this over time real understanding that decentralization is important. Localization is really important. So you see the municipality investing in micro composting centers, for example,
Mhm.
or local dry waste collection centers. But I think the core problem around waste collection is that the core contract that the municipality gives out is a pay per ton kind of model. So it's the number of tons you take to the landfill. And you don't have any KPIs around the differentiation and the management of that waste.
Okay. So segregation itself is then an issue that needs to be enforced more, more widely.
Yeah, it's a kind of chicken and egg situation where you have, like a traditional resident would feel, that why should I segregate? Because anyway, I put everything in the municipal bin and then that's taken to the landfill. So there is this kind of chicken and egg type of situation. It's not all the case. There are a lot of sandboxes, a lot of pilots that are trying different kinds of things, like more decentralized types of collection,
Mhm.
like more localized kind of work. But by and large, like especially when you take Chennai as an example, it's all focused on the number of tons you get on the line. So this is this old mindset of, the core mandate is to remove the waste from one place and take it to another place,
Mhm.
I would say.
Let's talk a little bit more about consumer behavior in this discussion, because you've been working largely in Chennai, and based on your experience, do you think there is some sort of pushback when you approach a new locality in the city and talk about waste segregation? Are the people reluctant to spend the time and effort segregating their waste, or is it just something that needs to be enabled by having the right kind of training and the right kind of bins at home?
Yeah, I think enabling is for me, I don't think it's like, a- I think Indians, like, again, we're not just in Chennai. We found, we've done this mapping and we've kind of looked at behavior across India, urban India,
Mhm.
also in some other geographies in the global south. And our feeling always comes down to there is this old culture of wanting to recycle and wanting to segregate and understanding that some materials have value, I think that's is just like there's no real solution oriented local program that really pushes, I think, in a meaningful way, segregation at source. And I think that's where the enabling needs to come in.
Mhm.
Like we personally believe that giving, just telling people like in the local neighborhoods, hey, do you know you have like 14 scrap shops in your neighborhood? And getting them to sometime, we organize these pop-ups, for example.
Mhm.
We get the scrap shop into the apartment, and on a Saturday morning, you just see the amount of excitement there is for people to bring their segregated waste and sell and things. So I think there is a big demand for consumers to want to manage their waste responsibly.
Mhm.
I think, of course, we have a way to go to educate people not to throw out. And, like I think we have like a little trash culture where we throw out, we throw a lot of waste and we like litter.
Mhm.
But I think beyond that, we have this culture of wanting to try to segregate and sell to the local scrap shop. And I think if we're able to enable that at scale, that's, when you're able to articulate a really exciting waste collection kind of program on the ground, that's when you're going to get Indians to really lean in and see more segregation at scale. So I really believe it's more on the enabling framework that
Yeah.
we need to focus on
Yeah.
to push the consumers.
Okay. Um, you talked about municipal solid waste. Now, my question to you and for our viewers is, could you tell us what are the most common types of municipal solid waste? What are the percentage categories, so to speak?
Yeah, again, the way we interpret it is like in Chennai, I think we generate something to 6,000, 7,000 tons every day.
Hmm.
And about 50 to 60% of that is organic waste. So technically things that you can compost
Yeah.
or make biogas or something like that. Then about 15 to 25% in that range is your recyclable waste, your dry
Hmm.
waste. And this is paper, plastic, glass, metal. There's a lot of movement in the recycling sector to include new types of materials. So they're trying to figure out what can they do with low value plastic. They're trying to figure out what can you do with textile.
Right.
So there's a dry waste component. Then there's the inert waste or hazardous waste component, which is that other set of fractions. So typically, an ideal system is where the organic waste is being composted or being sent for biogas. The dry waste is sent to formal, like through a system of collectors and aggregators to a formal recycler. And then the inert component is incinerated. That's the ideal system. But right now, everything is being landfilled.
And when you talk about recyclable waste, or let's talk specifically about plastics, because they seem to be a huge problem in the country. Have you been approached by companies that want to purchase plastic or want to do something about recycling plastic in a way that makes the inherent components of plastic reusable or changes them into some other form, let's say some sort of hydrocarbon based fuel?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of different things on the spectrum. It's always important for us to remind people. People get very siloed when they start talking recycling,
Hmm.
and they get super specialized suddenly. So, for example, in India, PET to textile has been this old business, 20, 30-year-old business,
Yeah.
where it's part of a global supply chain. So the amount of PET that's being collected, since we have been in the business has always been at a very high level. Club that with paper, glass. These are the core feedstocks that the informal sector collects. Waste pickers, kabadiwala shops, these informal material recovery facilities. That's kind of their bread and butter. Um, but then beyond that, there's also this demand. Over time we've seen, people try to come in and make investments in other types of materials as well. Like PP and PE, for example, has seen a big formalization in the last 10 years. And now you can say they're figuring out what they want to do for low value plastics, thermocol, and things like that. So there's a lot that the private sector is doing to try to figure out this and these different feedstocks. But there are some issues also. Like typically, the thicker the plastic, the more value it has, and so
Mhm.
the less people have to subsidize the cost of collection and recycling. But then the thinner the plastic gets, the more subsidy has to go in to manage that feedstock. And we see this kind of inflection point where PET is done really well. We believe that PP and PE, the rigids, will be collected at scale.
Mhm.
But then we worry about the low value plastics. We worry about these niche materials like thermocol and things like that. How would you manage that at scale? Theoretically, it can be done, but then there is a cost to that. And so who's going to subsidize that collection and make that happen is a big question. And, like EPR does play an important role, but then I also think that the more voluntary it is, and you have these key bottlenecks
Mm.
that will affect how the lower value stuff gets collected. And we always remind people also in this landscape, the super specialized landscape, that plastic is only one of the materials being mismanaged. The core issue is waste collection, municipal waste collection,
Yeah.
and from that stems the mismanagement of many types of materials. I'm an expert committee member with Niti Aayog on circular economy, and I was just briefed that textile waste is now one of the fastest rising waste streams in the municipality.
Yeah.
I think when I first started like 10 years ago, it was like 2%, 3% of the municipal feedstock, but now it's like 15%. And so, you have this industry jumping from one place to another also, like, like plastic, let's say it was hot, but then now maybe textile will get, but there is a core issue that's not being spoken about, which is how do you, what is the best way to manage waste collection at scale for a municipality in the global south? And I think that's where we're still thinking on these centralized, expensive kind of models that's modeled on the experience of the global north. Whereas what our kabadiwalas and scrap shops are showing us is a more effective, decentralized method of collection. And so we believe that, the future of waste collection in a cost-effective way for the municipality really hinges on the decentralization and then also being able to work with the informal sector effectively.
What role would you say that technology has to play in sustainably managing India's waste?
Yeah, huge, but I think again, we need to come at it from a very pragmatic
Mhm.
approach. So, rather than getting excited about blockchain, for example, and it might be hard, like, okay, you can raise money or whatever as a startup. I think for us, the way we see it is like we don't have baseline data on informal and formal infrastructure at the ward level. So we advocate a lot for like primary data collection on like digital twinning of infrastructure, for example. Where are the scrap shops? Where's the composting centers? Like work with an evidence-based baseline on what's out there and how would you work with that. So data would really be key for baselining material flows, volumes that need to be collected, what infrastructure is available. And so I think that technology can play a key role because it's never been cheaper to collect data at scale like this. That's one. I think on the second layer, traceability, so this is a continuous process business. When you look at recycling or waste collection, it's like the idea is to set up these continuous process systems where feedstock is going into these processing centers and it's all based on mass balance. So let's say a waste picker is picking up, let's say 100 kgs, selling it to a scrap shop. The scrap
Mhm.
shop is weighing it and has a general ledger system documenting this. So I think a digitalization of the transactions that are happening here, focusing on traceability, is also key for the private sector to be involved, big governments to get involved. And then the third aspect, I think it's kind of it is a technology play, but it's also again it needs to come from the health and safety and efficiency of operations perspective. So I'm saying going in and retrofitting informal material recovery facilities, making them safer, creating better health and safety protocols. These compliance protocols are really key for big companies to even touch this supply chain.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? So I think technology localization of, better baling, better processing, I think that's also really key. So it's a gamut where I say some of it is digitalization. So I think that's a really big lever that we can unlock. I think broadly data and understanding material flow is a key segment. And then I think technology localization is also a key place because again, you have technologies that can do some high end stuff, but it's not localized for the Indian context or the global south context. What is the point of having an NIR sorter that can do something if it costs $300,000? And where would you
Yeah.
implement that in the Chennai municipality? So we really need to localize a lot of the processing and recycling technology as well.
I see. So that you talked about traceability. Let me just quickly ask you a follow-up question to that. Would it be correct to assume that traceable waste fetches a higher value on the demand side?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It should, but you need to have people leaning in for that. And I still think, especially when you look at some of the feedstocks, people are just generally worried about who's going to subsidize that work. And we're not just talking about India, but in the global south itself. So I think traceability definitely leads to better outcomes, more transparency of who the stakeholders are, and
Mhm.
all of that kind of stuff. But then the devil is in the details. Like, are you only rendering traceable the recycling site, which is now how most people do it, where you just ensure that the recycler is following some protocols, but nothing
Mhm.
upstream is looked at. So it really depends on what type of traceability. Are you involving all the actors involved in upstream collection for that traceability? So again, definitely can lead to better outcomes, but the devil is in the details of using the right system, and localizing that system so that it actually succeeds in that local market.
Okay.
Yeah.
But just to elaborate on that point from your side, what role do you think that businesses play in adopting circularity in especially the waste management circle?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of like low-hanging fruits that businesses can employ that actually lead to better commercial outcomes from
Hmm.
their perspective. Um, so, for example, I'm thinking in an industrial cluster, really looking to optimize one person's waste and somebody else's input. We always talk about that somebody's chemical, effluent is somebody else's input feedstock for
Right.
another process. So I think there's a lot of industrial symbolic, like symbiosis there that's valuable. But then again, I think there's also this compliance question that, again, it's about holding people accountable. Like brands are putting in a lots of volumes out there, and it makes sense. It's logical for them to have a stake in the management of that feedstock. And so I think that, um, yes, like you need to look for first movers in the private sector who are really trying to build a system. And again, it's also a global question. Some of these materials are like globally a part of global supply chain. So it's about finding the right people who want to do something
Mhm.
and affect change, but then also holding them accountable. And so I think the government, I think NGOs, they have a key role to play here in looking at the outcomes of how do you increase the amount of waste being collected? Because at the end, there is a cost. And how does that get financed by whom? Yeah, I think definitely brand owners should be held accountable for that. And that's why EPR is a
Yeah,
good thing.
fair enough. I also want to ask you about your experiences with countries other than India. I understand that Kabadiwala Connect has operated in or continues to operate in Indonesia as well, and perhaps a few other global south countries. Has there been an instance where you have encountered a rather unique situation that you felt did not have an equivalent in India? And were you able to use your solution for that situation to some extent in India?
Um, no, it's a very interesting question. I think for us, what we have been fascinated to see is that, again, like our starting point was we won some grant money to do the first ever census on the informal supply chain in Chennai. And so, we mapped, like, we did this entire mapping of every single aggregator
Hmm.
in the system. And then using data, we were able to stratify these stakeholders and define them as three major stakeholders: what we call level zero aggregators, who are your waste pickers. They either walk the streets or they're on tricycles, picking up material, scavenging material they think they can sell for a profit to a local scrap shop. And so then, these scrap shops are small, hole in the wall places. They're completely like in Chennai, we found like 2,500 of them across the city. So wards had something like 10 to 15 scrap shops. So incredible decentralization. It's kind of like, a local pickup point for recycled waste. Again, material agnostic. So we've had a lot of positive outcomes getting them to pick up new material if you're able to define the right price for them and all of that kind of stuff. And then you have in Chennai, we found something like 300 informal material recovery facilities. So this supply chain, what we saw with our data was that they were collecting 130,000 tons of recyclable waste a year in Chennai. So that's about 25% of what the city generates. And we also noticed that they could be collecting a lot more. They could easily double the volumes that they were collecting. And we did this estimation based on how much shop size they had and how many cycles. Typically they sell in weekly cycles, but there were certain issues there. Like, for example, like you have to pay waste pickers in cash, but then they had working capital crunches, for example. Like they would run out of money to be able to pay waste
Hmm.
pickers, for example. The other thing that we found was really fascinating. Out of this 130,000 tons, it's only 30% of that feedstock that's coming from waste pickers. The other stuff is coming from the community going and selling to the scrap shop. So indicating this segregation mindset, especially that small businesses have, like your kirana shops and things like that. It's all integrated. And so that what for us, what we found in Chennai, what's been fascinating for us is people have been calling us to other places because this experience hits home to them. And so we're typically being called to places where they see a lot of the similarities, especially with the types of stakeholders like scrap shops and waste pickers, level one and level zeros being really focused on collection and being
Hmm.
material agnostic. And then the level twos, being clusters. There's a paper cluster, there's a plastic cluster. So you see those. We've seen that example in so now I can give you four major countries where the supply chain is set up the same: Sri Lanka, Indonesia, India, and Hong Kong.
Okay.
Believe it or not, where it's set up exactly this way, and they look the same. The way they operate is the same. So we've seen a lot of similarities, but then some small differences. Like in Indonesia, for example, most of the tricycles are motorized. That's one
Hmm.
thing we noticed. And they were typically moving further, longer distances, things like that. There are some unique ways of space optimization in a level two informal baler that we saw in Hong Kong that could really be valuable to how the MRFs in India do things. Some
I see.
small things like that, but broadly, it's more the similarities that are connecting us in the global south rather than differences, like especially when it comes to the level zero, the level one, and the level two aggregate.
Okay, that's really interesting to know. Um, and I think there is a lot of interesting points that you have raised, Siddharth. So thank you for your insights. Thank you for tuning in again. It was really interesting to learn about waste management and the role that technology can play towards a circular economy. We hope to talk more about this topic very soon.